Hi, today we're going to talk a little bit about advertising and public relations. So let's start with what is advertising. Advertising is a paid form of non-personal presentation of ideas, essentially, right? From an identified sponsor, and this last part is very important. So you need to have something that is non-personal, so salespeople cannot be involved, right? So this is not something that's coming from a direct person to you. Okay. Number two, it needs to have some sort of message on it, and number three, it needs to be from a clearly identified sponsor. Okay. So this will eliminate things like presentations that are given in YouTube by third parties, such as influencers, right? Because the sponsor is not clear unless it's stated as such, and then it's actually advertising, right? And this involves most of the traditional advertising that you've been seeing for the last 20 years. Things like billboards, pages of magazines that display information about brands, commercials that interrupt your typical TV programming, or some of the online programming like YouTube, etc., etc. Now, what kind of decisions do you need to make in advertising? Well, there are a set of decisions. Today we're going to be discussing some of them. First, you start with setting the objectives, what it is that you're trying to achieve with that advertising. Okay. We're going to talk about three different objectives that you can be trying to achieve, and maybe kind of like a sub version of it. Okay. Then you need to decide how much money you're going to actually invest in that advertising campaign. And then you need to decide on the message, what it is that you're going to say in that campaign. Where is that message going to be airing? So those are media decisions. And then finally, you're going to finish with looking at how well the campaign actually did work. And for that, we're going to be looking at things like return of advertising and other metrics that kind of give you feedback as to whether it actually did work properly or not. Now, let's start with objectives for the advertising campaign. The first thing that you need to do is decide what it is that you're trying to achieve with your campaign. So let's talk about three really different types of advertising objectives, and a fourth one that I think is a type of one of the three, although the book makes a distinction and it makes it an objective on itself. The first one is informative advertising. Now, this is essentially passing information to the consumer about a product or a service and what it is that the benefits or potential functional aspects of the product are. Informative advertising is absolutely essential when you're talking about new products. Okay, when you're launching a new product and the consumer or customer still doesn't know what that particular product is able to do for them, the informative aspects of advertising are absolutely essential. These informative aspects might actually become less important as the product life cycle goes along, because once that people already know that product really well and there is a widespread use of it, informative aspects of advertising are going to become less important. So, like I was mentioning before, informative aspects of advertising are particularly important, especially when you're talking about a radical new product, something that is really new that nobody knows, or that people don't know that you're capable of doing. Okay. Another aspect or another objective that you could be trying to achieve in advertising is persuasive advertising. Now, I will argue this is the more prevalent of all the objectives, and this is going to be a constant across all times, regardless of where you are within the product life cycle. The persuasive advertising, what it's trying to do is it's trying to convey the message that your product, your service, your offering is superior to those of the competition, and because of that, people should go ahead and either buy, try, acquire, or use your product. So persuasive is when they are trying to basically convince the customer. This, I will argue, is something that it's relevant and you will see across all stages of the product life cycle, regardless of whether it's a new product or not. Okay. Then you have comparative advertising. Now, I will argue that comparative advertising is a special version of persuasive advertising. What comparative advertising does is it directly attacks one of your competitors by providing direct comparison between your product or service and those of the competition. In this country, comparative advertising is actually legal. It's not legal in other countries. For example, in several European countries, comparative advertising is highly regulated, and it's for the most part non-existent. But in the US, it's legal, and you can see some fantastic campaigns if you type in YouTube or in Google. Pepsi versus Coke ads. There are some very, very funny and good ones, I will argue. But in my opinion, comparative advertising is a special type of persuasive advertising, where you're trying to achieve that persuasion by comparing your product to those of your competitors, especially usually your closest competitor. Okay. And then finally, you have reminder advertising, which is something that you're trying to achieve, especially late within your product life cycle. Once that the product is mature and people are maybe using less of it, or they're just not thinking about it because it's not cool and exciting and new anymore, you might actually need to remind people that, you know what, now it's maybe a good time to be buying my product. Coke does a lot of reminder advertising because they sell the product in a product category soda that is, at this point, at least in the US market, clearly mature. And because of that, you need to remind your customers more of the need. So what I was discussing is that these different objectives might have different importance depending on the product life cycle. Informative being the one that is most important early in the life cycle, persuasive, and maybe comparative, which I will argue is a subset of persuasive advertising, is pretty much constant across of the product life cycle. And then reminder advertising becomes more prevalent and important when the product is already mature and it's not growing. Now, here you have further examples that distinguish these three different types that I was mentioning before. So I'm not going to go through them again. You can read through them if you want. The book also has a few more examples in case there is any doubt about them. Okay. Now, how do you set your budget? We already discussed the first decision that we need to make, which is what is the objective we were trying to achieve, and we've talked about three different ones. Now let's consider budget. So how much are we going to invest in advertising? And for the most part, you need to make the same consideration with any of the tools, but now we're talking about advertising. And we're basically going to be talking about different factors that are going to impact how much money we invest in advertising. Number one, where you are within the product life cycle. Early on the product life cycle, it makes more sense to invest because people don't know about the product. So you're going to have to technically invest more, especially if you measure that investment as a ratio to the sales. Obviously, early on, your sales are going to be low, so you're going to have to invest heavily relative to the amount of money that you're bringing in terms of sales. Whereas later on, maybe it's less important. Okay, you might be milking your product, and maybe later on you will be cutting some of your advertising and just writing on the brand awareness and equity that you have built over the years. Market share is also going to be something that is going to dictate how much relative investment you put on advertising. And the way it will work is if you have a relatively low market share, for you to increase your market share or gain some territory in a competitive space, what's going to happen is it's going to cost you more money, right? So increasing your market share, if you're a low market share company, it's going to be difficult clawing back, right? Getting some of that market share from your competitors. So because of that, if you have a relatively low market share, which means low sales, you're going to have to relatively invest a higher percentage of those sales into your advertising budget. And finally, the last factor that will determine how much you should invest will be competition. And here will be simple, right? The more competitive a field it is with more competition, the more you're going to have to advertise because your advertising is going to have more of a dilution effect. What I mean by that is if there are a lot of companies talking about the relative strength of their offerings into the marketplace, because it's a very competitive industry, chances are people are going to forget what you're saying more frequently. There is going to be more clutter, and because of that, your message is going to have a harder time breaking through to the consumer. So the more competition you have, the more you're going to have to invest in advertising, especially relative to yours. So now that we've talked about budget and objectives, what we're going to be talking about is advertising strategy, which basically has two parts. The first part is what is the message that you're going to be trying to send to your customers. And the second part is where is that message going to be placed, which is essentially your media decision. So let's talk about those next. Now, when it comes down to the message, one of the things that you're going to have to consider today is that advertising and marketing in general, it's at a spot where there is a lot of noise in any channel really that you pick. And the way you see that is because there is a lot of advertising clutter. Advertising is absolutely everywhere. It doesn't matter where you go, what kind of media you're consuming, there is going to be advertising there, right? And if there is no advertising, you're paying some sort of premium for it. So that's the state of advertising. And because of that, breaking through that clutter is going to be difficult, right? So people are having to come up with more innovative and essentially different ways of advertising that is going to really cut through the clutter and draw the attention from the customer in a way that is going to enable you to actually get that message to them, which is rather hard today. There's a lot of technology that is actually influencing this clutter aspect. For example, you have DVRs that enable you to obviously record your programming if you're talking about traditional TV, and then skip the ads if you're watching it at a later time. You can do the same thing in YouTube. You can install a little application called AdBlock that will make sure that you don't get bothered by any of the ads, by any of the channels, etc., etc., etc. So consumers have lots of technology on their side that enables them to bypass some of the commercials, and if they don't have that technology, they still don't pay a lot of attention because they are bombarded by so many ads all the time. Now, in a response to this, what has happened is a lot of companies have tried to make the advertisings more entertaining, more valuable. Basically, make the advertising so exciting, not because it tells you a lot of a story about the product, but because it's entertaining on its own accord. And you have examples of this called advertisement, right? Where you just watch something that you don't even maybe know it's a commercial in itself. And the reason why it works is because it has a little bit of an underlying message behind it, but the actual main theme of the message is just entertainment. You can see this, for example, if you go to YouTube and you type in Chipotle, you say Chipotle advertising, and you will see that there is a little video that shows you this, two little kids, and it's kind of like a cartoon, right? Two little kids that basically have kind of like a little lemonade stand challenge between the two of them since they were kids, and how they build this amazing empire in terms of sales, but in the end everything goes awry, and at the end of the day the only reason why they did it is because they liked the other person, but they were not really willing to take the first step. So there is kind of like a little romantic theme at the end, and if you watch the last few scenes in the ad, you will see that this is about Chipotle. But until you get to that, you really don't notice anything. It's more like a short documentary or a short movie that has some entertainment value on its own, and the advertising piece just comes towards the end and is very subtle. So there is a little bit of a hint, and of course Chipotle is what makes it all better, but the interesting thing is you can just watch it. In fact, I've shown this to my kids and it's entertaining on its own, right? Another way of talking about this is called native advertising, where basically the advertising itself blends seamlessly with the content around it, and because of that it's kind of hard to know that it's really native advertising. Actually, a type of this is product placement within movies and video games, right? Which are very, very, very common. So if you watch a lot of the movies, they have sometimes very shameless plugs. And you can see this also in video games, right? So if you're driving a car in a driving simulator, there are all these brand names, like in all the billboards around the circuits. Those are actually paid. So that's actually placed within the video game and obviously seamlessly works within the activity, and because of that you can't even tell it's an advertising unless you know. Now, other than this novel approach, try to break through the clutter. The basics are always the same. When it comes down to the message, the absolute most important part is to start with a clear positioning strategy. So it all starts with your positioning strategy that goes before the advertising. So if you have a clear positioning that you're trying to achieve in the mind of the consumer, now the question is, what kind of message are you going to use to essentially enable that positioning, to really make it tangible and concrete, right? So what are you going to say that it's in line with the positioning that you're trying to achieve? Okay, and related to this positioning are going to be the key benefits that your customer is going to be looking for, right? So if your positioning is an upscale luxury brand, then the benefits will be associated with that high quality, uniqueness, maybe exclusivity, etc., etc. So those benefits and the positioning need to be directly tied together, okay? And you're going to use these benefits in the messaging that you're going to use within the positioning. Now, of course, these benefits are going to be unique to each industry, right? So if you're talking about a car, or you're talking about chocolates, or if you're talking about a age-reducing cream for your, for example, eyes or for your face, the benefits are going to be unique to that particular industry, but there are some overarching benefits that are going to show up in many industries, such as performance, reliability, luxury, and affordability. Those are all benefits that resonate across many industries, and some companies are going to be positioning their brands around some of those benefits. So when you're actually looking at how brands are doing their advertising, just be looking for what kind of benefits are they touting in their commercials. Now, when you're crafting this message, what you need to do, other than pick what is the key positioning idea and benefits associated with it, is what kind of creative concept are you going to use to sell these benefits, right? How are you going to do it? And to do that, it needs to be meaningful, believable, and distinctive. And this is very difficult to do. Okay, meaningful meaning that consumers and customers should care about the benefits that you're talking about. Believable, that whatever story you're telling, they have reasons to believe. It's not just a pie in the sky, something that may or may not be possible. And distinctive, it is to enable you to draw their attention, cut through the clutter and all the other noise that it's in the marketplace. So making it unique is actually difficult, but very useful if you can manage it, right? And on top of this, creative concept aspects, what you need to do is you need to decide on the appeals that you're going to use, in terms of delivering this message. And there are more than the ones that I have listed here, okay? But typical appeals that are used in advertising are humor. I don't think I need to explain that. Fear, this is typically used in products where what you're doing is you're touting the things that you will miss if you don't buy the product, although it could also be used in general for other products where you're trying to discourage the use. This you can see, for example, when you're looking at tobacco, now vaping, you have all this campaign about what can happen to you. You're vaping, right? So they're using fear appeal by showing you the negative consequences of a behavior that they are trying to discourage. One of the more classic appeals in advertising, and it's widely used for both sexes, is sex appeal, right? Having a model that is attractive, whether it's a male or a female, I don't care, it doesn't matter, right? Everybody knows that it works, right? At least in some contexts, if you do it tastefully and for the right products, right? What else? Then you have social appeal, which is this idea that we are part of groups, And because of that, we want to be part of society. So oftentimes showing what will happen if you buy this product, that will be kind of like the positive aspect of it, right? What kind of group will you be part of, right? And you can also play the other way around. How if you don't have this, right, what kind of part or group you will not be part of. Also appealing to some sort of social benefit that might actually be desirable for your product will fall within the social appeal implementation of the commercials. You also have personal appeal, where you're just trying to place this product into the life of a customer and what's going to happen if they use the product or if they don't use the product, right? You can actually play it both ways, right? I have an example of that here with a Gillette commercial, right? You can see it right here, which basically talks about how we have learned from scientific studies that little babies need to be in contact with the skin of their parents, and that helps them basically develop better over time. So physical contact is very important, especially when they are really young. And it's playing off of that fear, in a way, of the father of not being an appropriate father if, he keeps his beard in this case. So what can you do? You can just shave in a way that you can not be worried about putting your face next to a baby, because it's going to irritate the baby, right? And even if you are not a father, right, you still get the message, right? And or another one that is also very common is youth appeal, right? Everybody wants to be young, right? So just, emphasizing what are the benefits related to age, or maybe maintaining your age or looking more youthful, etc. But there are other appeals too, but these, I will say, are the most common appeals that are used in advertising right now. You might be able to find others when you're doing your exercise 6 assignment. Okay. Now, the execution of the message is essentially how these big ideas that I've been discussing are actually going to take concrete shape and form, right? And there's just going to be very specific, so you're going to have to decide, who the actors are going to be if you're talking about a video, or if there's picture, who's going to be representing the consumer, or any other characters that need to be actually in the shot, right? And there is a lot of creativity involved in here. In fact, one thing is interesting about message execution is that most of it is not done internally within the firms. These are usually outsourced to advertising agencies, and it's usually something that is not done in-house by most major corporations. Okay. Now, within the messaging, also there are very different styles that can actually be used, and there are a few that are kind of archetypical, and you have them right here, but it's not limited to this at the end of the day, right? From showing, lifestyle to a fantastic world that probably is not believable, but you could see the product giving you this kind of benefits, to musicals, to using a typical testimonial or endorsement. There are different styles that can be used in the commercial to achieve essentially the same message. Okay, so I want you guys to realize that regardless of which one of these execution styles you use, the message that you're trying to convey is still the same, and it needs to be consistent with your positioning. So it all starts with positioning, and then you decide on how that message is going to be conveyed to the public. And this is mostly a creative endeavor at this point. Okay. Now, after we have talked about some of the message aspects, let me discuss a couple of things that I've kind of hinted at, but I haven't maybe explained enough. One is the tone of the message. This is very important. It can be either positive or negative, okay? And they both work, but in my experience, if you're trying to build brands, positive is the way to go in the long term. For a short term effect, negative still okay, but I will argue that negative effect doesn't really convey such a reasonable message, especially in the medium and long term. And the way you're going to also do the execution, you might have some keywords that you might need to use that are either associated with the concepts that you were talking about, and also what is expected within the industry. So there might be some certain things that need to be mentioned because they are particularly important for customers, especially for them to understand what kind of benefits they're going to actually get from this. And then the way you're going to format it, it really depends on what kind of advertising media you're going to be using. But if you're talking about print, for example, you're going to have different elements which you have here outlined, right? So you're going to have the illustration, you're going to have the headline, and then you're going to have the actual copy of the commercial. But these are not unique to all. These are unique to some degree to what it is that you're doing, because if you will be doing a video, instead of having these three, you'll have story that you're trying to convey. So you might have a little storyline that it's first outline, then you'll have a script, and then on top of the script you'll start shooting the commercial, etc. So these formatting aspects are not all universal. It really depends on what kind of commercial it is that you are actually using. Now, one of the most interesting, I would say, trends in marketing in general and advertising in particular is that a lot of this creative endeavor that it's actually so challenging to do well, that ad agencies have been doing for many years and that our experts are, can actually be outsourced also to consumers. So one thing that you can actually do is you can ask your customers and actual consumers what it is that it will resonate with them in terms of a commercial. And many companies that have actually done this in the past. One of my favorites is Doritos, right? So Doritos, if you go to Google, actually, if you go to YouTube and if you type Doritos Super Bowl challenge, one thing that you will find is you will find a series of commercials that Doritos have been airing during the Super Bowl, I will say for the last at least 10 years, maybe a little bit longer, where they actually started a contest, right? I couldn't come up with the word. They started a contest where they allow anybody who is a Doritos fan to send ideas for a commercial for the Super Bowl. And the way essentially they will do the contest is they will just ask them to upload a simple video that will basically be an execution of the ad. And from the ones that actually won, and they literally got thousands and thousands of suggestions every year, or by suggestions I mean videos uploaded to YouTube they could actually review and check. And from the ones that actually won through a selection process with some marketing professionals within the firm, they were actually shot professionally. And some of these people actually got even a job offer to job the marketing department within Doritos, right? So, and they got some money out of it. So pretty cool way of involving your customers. And to be honest with you, some of the best Doritos commercials actually came from an effort like this, right? Because, one thing that we have learned over the years is that the best people don't actually work for you, right? The smartest people don't work for you. So actually getting your customers involved in this process is really priceless, right? Because you have access to a huge pool of talent, and in a very inexpensive way, you can actually manage this consumer-generated content. Okay, now once that we have the message, okay, which is what we have been talking about, after you have your message created, now the question is, what media are you going to be using for conveying this message to your customers, right? So you're going to have to basically think about what kind of media types there are. Within those media types, when are those commercials going to be airing or being displayed? Okay, what kind of reach, frequency, and impact are you actually looking for? And what the timing is going to be. So let me talk about some of these aspects. So let's talk about the metrics that you're going to be looking at to determine your advertising strategy. The first one is going to be reach. Reach is the percentage of people within your target market that are exposed at least one time during the given period of time that you're measuring your advertising effectiveness, okay? So this could be a week, it could be a month, or it could be a year. Usually it's not a year. People are going to be looking more like weekly or maybe monthly exposure, right? So what you're doing is you're literally counting out of the people in your target market, which is going to be narrowly defined. So for example, just a silly example, it could be people between the ages of 18 and 25 that live within a 50-mile radius from the city center of Richmond in Virginia, right? That is a very narrowly defined target market, and within that target market, you will just basically literally check how many people actually saw the commercial. Whether you do this by sampling or you actually count it, because you have some way of doing that, like using Facebook ads, for example, they will give you a good idea about these metrics. That will be your reach. Frequency is out of those people that actually saw the commercial, how many times on average did they see the commercial? Did they see it 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 1.5 times, right? Notice that this frequency is probably not going to be a whole number in real life, okay? But both reach and frequency are quantitative metrics that are objectively determined. Okay. Impact, on the other hand, is a qualitative value that essentially looks at, how strong the impact of that ad is going to be on anybody who is going to see it. Right? And this will be given by an expert based on the exposure that they have to other commercials in that industry and how distinctive, unique, strong the message is within that. And obviously this is going to be a qualitative metric that is going to be determined by an expert. Okay. And then you have engagement. Engagement is more of an online slash social media metric, and that's basically looking at any way in which the customer is relating or interacting with either the brand, the company, their website, their platform, right? And these are metrics such as ratings, number of viewers within, for example, a YouTube platform. It could be ratings, it could be number of clicks within a particular website. These are all engagement metrics, number of comments that somebody leaves, within a platform, right? So the more interactions that you're having with the customers, the idea, I guess, is the better, right? Okay. Now, here you have some profiles for basically the typical media types that are used. So you have TV, right? What are the advantages of TV? Has a good mass marketing appeal, right? Because it has, a wide coverage. And if you look at cost per exposure, it's pretty low, right? It also is rich media because you have access to not only text, which you can still place in there if you want to, but you have images and you have sound, so it's a lot more rich than maybe other media like radio, for example. Okay. The downside of TV is that it tends to be expensive overall, even though cost per exposure is low. Cost in general and budget needs to be pretty high. Also, the problem with TV is that it's a pretty fragmented media, right? There are many TV stations or TV channels, and they use a lot of advertising. So because of that, there's a lot of clutter, and it's kind of hard to cut through the media, right? It's hard to especially target very narrow target markets, right? It's more of a mass market appeal. You have digital social media. The nice thing about it is that it enables you, it gives you the tools to very narrowly target your market. So it's very selective. Okay, it tends to be low cost in general. Both cost of exposure is low, and also you don't need to have a huge budget to do a campaign, so you can start small. Okay, the nice thing also is you basically get results right away, and the nice thing finally is that you can measure your success and link it directly to action metrics such as clicks on a website or number of orders that come from a particular campaign. So it's very nice if you're trying to assess the effectiveness of the advertising campaign. Okay. Now, what is the downside? Potentially, a lot of people ignore a lot of the messages, even more so than in other media like TV or print, right? So click-through rates are extremely low right now for online advertising, right? So it's unclear how good of an impact it actually has, although you usually only pay per exposure, which is nice. So it has some upsides and it has some downsides as well. You can use newspapers, right? Nice thing about newspapers is that they are particularly useful for local commercials. So if you are a small firm and you're interested in reaching people locally, newspapers, I will say it's a pretty appealing ad campaign strategy or a type of media that you will use. They also, the traditional media, they have kind of like a image of being serious, and because of that, being more believable in terms of the content that it's on them. So there's a little bit of a brand halo effect, which is a nice thing. Okay. The downside is that most people get rid of the newspaper within a day if they actually look at the newspaper at all. Okay. The downside also is that there's a huge shift, especially for the newer demographics. Younger people are not reading the newspaper that much, so depending on what target market you actually have, it might not actually be the best. You have direct mail, right? And online campaigns. You can also do email on this. It's not just old snail mail. Okay. Nice thing is you can target segments pretty selectively, like you can also with digital and mobile. Okay. So you can buy a database that gives you mail addresses, and that's going to be targeted to what it is that you're trying to do. So it's kind of nice that way. Okay. It also enables you to personalize the advertising, right? So you can direct the letter, for example, if it's in a letter form, in an email form, to the particular consumer, because you actually have their name and their email address. So you can actually address them by their name, which is always nice and a good way of cutting through the clutter, right? Downside is we get so much direct mail that it turns into junk mail. In fact, if you look at what happened in the 80s in Eastern Europe when the wall of Berlin fell, is that there was literally no direct mail. It didn't exist. So every time you got a piece of mail, it was from somebody that you knew or the government, something important. So what happened is when companies started doing direct mail in like Eastern Germany, for example, the response rates were insane. They were like upwards of 80%. And the reason why is because nobody knew what direct mail was, and they were expecting any letter to come their way to be actually read thoroughly and taken seriously, which obviously nowadays is not something that it's going to happen, at least not here in the United States. Okay, you have magazines, they have some nice things, high quality print, which means that, you can convey a more luxurious feel. So depending on your positioning, this might actually be nice. Also, they tend to have a good, image. Because of that, you're going to pass along some of that positive attitude towards your brand from being using an ad in that particular magazine, right? So it's kind of nice. The downside is you usually have a long lead time. So if you're going to do a campaign, you can't just immediately do it. Unlike, for example, in direct mail or digital platforms where, from the time you decide on launching a campaign, time you can actually go ahead and do it. It's a very short period of time, whereas in traditional magazines, you're going to need oftentimes upwards of a month to be able to actually print any of the images. So because of that, you can just quickly react to what happens in the marketplace, and they tend to be relatively expensive. You also have radio, which, depending on your channel, you have also the channel effect, which is nice, this halo effect that I was talking about. Also for local small businesses, it has a lot of appeal. Obviously, radio stations, for the most part, not all of them are local. So because of that, there is a nice element to them. Downside is not rich media, like for example TV, right? So it's only audio. Because of that, conveying the message might actually be more challenging. Okay. Also, it's unclear how much exposure you actually get, given the fact that the only thing that it's happening is hearing. So because of that, if you look at how much people remember, image is usually remembered more than words, especially if they are not read. When you read it, like for example in print and magazine, when you read something, it's more likely to stay in memory according to psychology. So there's a little bit of an issue with radio in that regard, or at least there could be. Okay, and then you have the outdoor options, like all the billboards, etc., that you see, cars, buses, and it does have some nice aspects to it, right? Is that, for example, billboards, you're going to see the same billboard over and over and over again. So instead of only getting one exposure like it might happen with other options, this is going to be more of a build up, and because of that, it might actually work better. Okay, it's relatively inexpensive too, which is nice. Okay, the downside is everybody's going to get access to that billboard, so it's very hard to uniquely target who it is that you're looking for, unless every demographic and everybody within a particular regional area is what you're interested in. Then maybe it's a good fit. Okay. So how are you going to go about selecting media? I think I've already talked about a lot of the aspects of the different media and which one excels at one thing or another. But essentially what you're going to be doing is you're going to be looking at impact, you're going to be looking at effectiveness, which is how likely are they to be seen by the target market that you're interested in, and cost. And when I say cost, you're going to be looking at overall cost of building the campaign, but also you're going to look at cost per exposure. And this might actually vary. You might have campaigns that, the cost per exposure will be low, but actually the buy-in to be able to do the campaign, it's going to be very high. And because of that, you might actually not be able to do that. For example, if you want to advertise in the Super Bowl, a lot of people are going to be exposed to that commercial, but buying an ad for the Super Bowl is extremely expensive. Okay, now that we've talked about advertising, let's briefly talk about public relations. Public relations is essentially conveying a positive corporate image using publicity and engaging the different publics that are related and relevant to the company. Okay, and the way you're going to do this is essentially by creating stories, maybe events that are going to enable you to share what the company stands for and what it is that the company is trying to achieve and what they are a good corporate citizen. Now, why should we do any public relations? Well, there are some aspects about public relations that makes it particularly appealing. Number one is that for the most part, public relations tends to be very inexpensive. Unlike a traditional advertising campaign that involves paying media and also paying to create the message, so it can be quite costly. Public relation efforts tend to be pretty inexpensive. So for example, writing a news story and sending them to all the news agencies that operate, for example, now in the internet, is something that can be done for a very low cost, right? The cost of having somebody work on this maybe for a few hours and just sharing it, right? So it has really low cost, and because of that, if you're looking at return on investment, it has really good metrics, right? So it's something that you should actually do whenever you have a chance. Also, for the most part, a lot of these events and stories, they influence the public in a more positive and indirect way. Because advertising oftentimes is taken with a grain of salt by most savvy consumers, which nowadays is pretty much everybody, because everybody has a smartphone with them and they are checking information about the products instead of just believing what you say on your commercials, right? So because of that, public relations have a stronger impact oftentimes because people have less of a screen when they are listening to stories, for example, that are given by their favorite news program, right? Where they are talking about the product launch of a new company and they are doing so in an objective manner, right? They're just reporting that it's happening etc., etc., right? So because of that, the impact might actually be more subtle, but also it might actually work in a better way, right? Now, what kind of tools are you going to use within public relations other than writing news pieces? By the way, the reason why you write the news piece is so that the news agencies don't have to write the piece themselves, right? So what you do is you create all these materials that essentially will be easy to disseminate through the news agencies, and the news agencies are in the business of writing news. So if you lower their cost of writing an article by providing them a story that you have already written, it's going to be a lot more likely that they talk about your company because they need to write about something, right? So it's always a good idea when you're launching new products or starting new initiatives that you think that could be interesting and you want people to know about them, that you actually write a news piece and you just share it with the people that are actually in the business of writing news, right? You might also create special events and events. For example, if you look online, there are many public relation examples. In case of events, the best thing I can think of, for example, recently Tesla launched the Cybertruck. If you actually type in Cybertruck launch in Google, you might find a video of the event, which is kind of neat, especially because you get to see how in the event things didn't exactly go as planned, and because of that they ended up breaking the glass that was supposed to be bulletproof and unbreakable. Yeah, you can hear in the Joe Rogan podcast Elon Musk talking about that event and how they really screwed up and they didn't know originally why it happened. I think now they kind of sorted out why, because apparently they tried multiple times offline and it didn't break and just happened this time because apparently they did it in the wrong order or something. Okay, so look it up, but you have many ways in which you can create publicity. Here you have some of the tools that you can actually use for this, and some of which have a high impact and low cost, like I was saying before.